Once upon a time, there was a man who saw a problem and decided to fix it. What came as a result was nothing short of astonishing, a place that allowed families to come together and escape the real world to explore those of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. A magical environment that was further enhanced by great customer service and quality. Unfortunately, things would not always be this way, as after Walt Disney's tragic passing in 1966, things would slowly deteriorate for the company. While his theme parks did grow, including his vision of Walt Disney World, over time though, they became rather comfortable in their current state, so providing guests with a fantastic experience while not continuing to grow and innovate like they once were. And at the time, it made sense. Other parks really had no other outside threats that could threaten their dominance over the theme park industry and the global market share that they hold. However, one little competitor that they overlooked at first was Universal Studios. You see, while being overlooked, Universal Studios was on a steady path to grow their market share in the industry, both in their domestic parks and worldwide. However, it wasn't until 2010 when they really shook up the industry and started to be noticed by lots of people when they debuted the first fully immersive land in the form of the Wizarding World of Harry Potter. It was at this moment when Disney realized what a big threat Universal could be and started to make plans for how to change their theme parks to continue to adapt and grow once again to help try to maintain their market share over the theme park industry. Unfortunately though, by the time things came around in 2017 was the first of 3 immersive lands, it was almost too late. You see, while Disney took 7 years to try and catch up, Universal continued their path and doubled down on their investments, really growing and expanding their resorts worldwide and continuing to grow more and more market share. To make matters worse, 3 years later, the 2020 pandemic hit, and it was here when guests really began to notice the major differences that the companies took and the impacts that would have on guests. Upon reopening, one of the safety features that the companies took to help make sure the resorts were a safe environment during this increased focus on germs and illness was reducing the capacity and allowing only a limited amount of guests into their parks. When it came to Universal, their approach was the early bird gets the worm approach that was much more forward-facing for the guest experience, as if you got there early enough, you're almost guaranteed a spot inside of the park. However, once a park did reach capacity, guests would be given the option to wait in line and be slowly ushered in after enough people exit. Disney, on the other hand, took a different approach, as they would be utilizing a reservation system to properly ensure that there was enough people inside the park at a certain time to maintain these new, safer guidelines. Unsurprisingly, this was not well received by guests, as not only did it add additional complications to the process and surprise those that did not know about the system, but it also took away lots of the flexibility and freedom that came with being an annual pass holder. To make matters worse, Disney would also limit the amount of reservations available to guests and vary them based on the type of ticket that they had, making them more available to the more profitable day ticket guests and less available to annual pass holders, meaning that some annual pass holders couldn't get a reservation even if there were ones available for those that had a day ticket. After making their ways inside the gates, the differences in the parks was relatively the same. However, that said, there were certain aspects that changed forever, including Disney's removal of their former FastPass system that used to be free for guests. Universal, on the other hand, continued to operate their premium FastPass service to guests, and while it was an upcharge, it was a lot more stress-free and more beneficial for the guests than Disney's was, as not only did it not require any reservations, but would also allow guests to go on as many rides as they would like. To make matters worse, the guests that did choose to experience the parks after COVID would find at Disney World they would not be able to park hop, even if you did have an annual pass, and once it was initially reinstated, after several months' absence, guests would only be able to do so after 2 p.m. Not only did this further complicate the guest experience, but it also showed how the company viewed the guests that would enter through its gates, as at Disney, the customer experience was no doubt declining and a definite decline from where it used to be. Speaking of the guest experience, one aspect that a company could not control and it affected Disney and Universal, as they both ultimately had to make the tough choice to let go of some of its workers during the COVID pandemic, as they're unsure how long this closure would last, was that the staff that were laid off during the pandemic may or may not have chosen to be rehired by the company or choose to join them once again. In addition to this, a bunch of new staff were also hired by the company to help offset some of the lost staff and to operate the park in order to get it open to guests. As a result of these factors, and combined with the fact that hiring these people back was a necessity for getting the park up and running once again, was that the companies themselves were more laid back and open to who they would hire, as opposed to the higher bar that was set before the pandemic. One aspect of the guest experience in a theme park that the company did have a lot more control over was the new rides and additions that were coming to the park before the pandemic hit and how they handled them during the pandemic. When it comes to Universal, they chose to keep building and expanding on the parks even when guests won't be able to experience them at the given moment, with a great instance of this being the construction of the Velocicoaster. In addition to this, rides that were closer to being done were opened shortly after the parks themselves reopened, with the Bourne Stunt Spectacular debuting less than a month after the Orlando Resort reopened to guests, and them debuting Secret Life of Pets Off the Leash when the parks themselves did reopen in Universal Hollywood, which faced a year closure. On the flip side of this, Disney took the approach of pausing construction during the pandemic and continuing a slow process after the parks themselves did reopen, even delaying rides and attractions, some of which were almost ready to go, until they can better align them with a certain milestone or celebration in the park. A prime example of this in the parks was the clone attraction of Tron Light Cycle Run, which was originally announced in 2017 and didn't open all the way until April of 2023. To make matters worse, the market share for Disney continued to fall, as another approach that Universal took to continue to show that they cared about the guest experience and the guests that entered their gates was continue to provide them with several offerings and seasonal events to show that they cared about the guest experience, including going all out on certain pass holder benefits, including annual pass holder nights. However, it is important to note here that this could very well be a part of Universal's strategy to win over fans and customers and slowly remove some of these benefits as time goes on and they have gained their loyalty. This is actually something that we have seen in the past, as the Disney resorts used to offer great benefits to both guests and annual pass holders, but removed these over time after they have gained their loyalty. This turning of the knife is even more evident today, as not only have these benefits been long gone to guests, but the company has actually done the opposite, really showcasing how much they no longer care that much about their once loyal customers. As some prime instances of this being anti-consumer behaviors by the company that continue to last to this day and going far beyond their initial requirement, with a great instance of this being the park reservation system. To further add to the lineup of ways that Universal continued to take more and more market share away from Disney, or at least try to, was the quality of their parks and experiences, as this themselves have greatly improved over time and are a great increase from their once screen-based days. Disney, on the other hand, would continue to add insult to injury, as unlike their previous great rides and attractions which relied heavily on physical animatronics and show scenes, their newer additions relied more heavily on screens and projection mapping. In addition to this, when they were building these rides, it was apparently obvious that they took the cheap route on certain materials, something that hurt them in the long run, as they ultimately had to go back through and fix them. In addition to this, one of the ways that the parks also tried to save money was by reducing the cost spent on maintenance. Overall, while the experience of the Disney parks has declined over the years, Walt Disney's vision of providing families with an innovative and immersive experience for everyone to enjoy still lives on today.